So our questions for today are the following. First, why is Washington using the card of the cluster bombs now? And the second question is the following. What will be the impact of this move on the confrontation in Ukraine? We are very happy to have Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos with us. The host is introducing you. Dr. Marcus, welcome from London. Why did the US, of course, decide to provide Ukraine with such ammunition now, in this timing?
The decision to supply cluster bombs to the Ukrainian government is a sign of abject desperation and abject frustration on behalf of the American government concerning the direction of the war in Ukraine. Because irrespective of what the useful idiots who comprise Western mainstream media say, the reality is that Russia is winning the war in Ukraine, and indeed has been winning the war in Ukraine ever since the Russian army entered Ukraine on the 24th of February of 2022. Now, that reality has become all the more acute for Washington given the calamity that is the so-called counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army in Zaporozhie and also in the southern part of the Donestsk oblast. Because this so-called offensive by the Ukrainian army, which is now has been going on for about 4 weeks, has been, as I said, a complete catastrophe. Approximately 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers have perished, together with hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian armoured vehicles which have been destroyed. So, by the Americans now deciding to send cluster bombs to the Ukrainian government, this is a way of the Americans, firstly, trying to kill as many Russian soldiers as possible, and secondly, trying to cause as many obstacles as possible for the impending Russian offensive in Ukraine, which will be enormous. So whatever the Americans now send to the Ukrainian government, nothing can avert what will be the inevitable outcome of the war in Ukraine. A Russian victory, which will see the Russian army capture either all of Ukraine or most of Ukraine, and then the lands which the Russian army have captured will be absorbed into the Russian Federation.
Yes, Dr. Papadopoulos, why did you consider that this move is based on the desperation of the US? Because this is a war and allies should support each other. Why do you consider that there's a desperation on this level?
Well, first of all, how many so-called game changers have there been thus far in the war in Ukraine? First of all, there was the supply to the Ukrainian government of anti-tank weapons, which was supposed to be a game changer. Then there was the supply of the M777 artillery gun to the Ukrainian government, which was supposed to be a game changer. Then there was the supply of the HIMARS, which was supposed to be a game changer. Then there was the supply of German Leopard and British Challenger tanks, which were supposed to be game changers. Then there was the supply of depleted uranium, which was supposed to be a game changer. Then there was the supply of British Storm cruise missiles, which was supposed to be a game changer. Then there is the talk of F-16s being sent to Ukraine, which are supposed to be a game changer. Now, some in the West are saying that cluster bombs will be a game changer. The reality is that regardless of what the Americans and the British and any other Western government sends to Ukraine, now that the Russian army is in Ukraine and is entrenched in Ukraine, nothing will dislodge the Russians from there. The Ukrainians to date have lost, in terms of fatalities, in terms of soldiers, between 250,000 and 300,000. Those are losses which cannot be sustained. The Ukrainian losses at Bakhmut, for example, was simply tremendous in that many of the Ukrainian army's best legions were destroyed there. And regarding the so-called Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporozhie and in Donetsk, again, it is believed that some 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers in a period of about 4 weeks have died there. And the Ukrainian army hasn't even come up against the first line of the Russian defense. That is simply appalling. And it demonstrates to anyone with even an ounce of military knowledge that the Ukrainian army is virtually a spent force. If we take the so-called Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Ukrainians attacked without any air cover whatsoever. On top of that, if the Ukrainians were going to be successful, they should have firstly had air supremacy, and at the same time, they should have pounded the Russian defense lines for weeks on end with artillery and air power, and yet there are no Ukrainian aircraft in the air. There was no Ukrainian pounding of Russian defense lines. All that happened was that the Ukrainian High Command ordered their ground forces to advance on what are the strongest defense fortifications anywhere in the world, with the inevitable result that those Ukrainian ground forces would be slaughtered.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you. Stay with us. So, of course, we will talk more about this issue, and we will focus on cluster bombs. Those cluster bombs have, of course, different types, but those cluster bombs are bombs which release a number of projectiles on a certain impact, and those bombs, of course, were designed in order to destroy tanks and also soldiers. Those bombs are used via artilleries that were provided by the US to Ukraine, such as the howitzer artilleries, and of course, the bombs that will be provided to Ukraine are 155mm bombs. According to the UN, the use of cluster bomb is totally prohibited because those bombs, of course, provide a huge threat on civilians, and because, of course, it leaves a huge number of unexploded ammunition that will cause harm also. In 2008, a convention on cluster munition was, of course, signed by 111 countries, while 12 countries had signed this convention but did not ratify it, while the US, Russia and Ukraine did not sign on this convention, and they are not part of this convention. The US Army used those bombs during the 60s and the 70s in Cambodia, in Vietnam and in Laos. In Laos, in fact, the US used 270 cluster bombs. They have used the same kind of bombs in Iraq in 2003, and despite the fact that in 2009 a bill was signed in the US in order to prohibit the use of those bombs, Donald Trump sent those bombs to South Korea, and Biden is doing the same. Back to you, Dr. Papadopoulos. If those cluster bombs will make no change on the ground, why is everyone concerned by the use of those bombs? The EU, in one way or another, criticized this move. Even some Democrats had, of course, criticized this move. Human rights NGOs also criticized this move. If the use of those bombs will not change what is ongoing on the ground, why did the US decide to provide this type of ammunition, and what kind of danger are we going to face?
Well, cluster bombs are particularly nasty weapons because they can remain hidden and active for many years after the cessation of a war, which of course will cause the maiming and deaths of civilians. So that is why there are many countries around the world which have expressed disgust at Washington's decision to supply these weapons to the Ukrainian government. I would say, though, that when it concerns the British government's announcement that it disagrees with America's decision to supply cluster bombs to the Ukrainian government, I would regard this as a situation of Britain playing the good cop and America playing the bad cop. Because when Britain took the decision to supply depleted uranium, which is another foul weapon, to the Ukrainian government, the American government expressed its view that Britain was wrong to do this. So the Americans and the British essentially are one entity on the international stage. They play good cop and bad cop when it suits them. But as I said moments ago, why has the American government taken the decision to send to cluster bombs to the Ukrainian government? To try and slow down an imminent Russian offensive in Ukraine, and thereby to try and kill as many Russian soldiers as possible. I would also add on top of that, that once the Russian army is victorious in Ukraine, whereby most of Ukraine or all of Ukraine has been absorbed into the Russian Federation, these cluster bombs will undoubtedly maim and kill many civilians. Now, why do I raise this issue? Because Russophobia, hatred of Russians, has been embedded in Washington and in London for centuries. The Americans and the British have a particular loathing of East Slavs. They care nothing for Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians. When it comes to the population of Ukraine, the Americans and the British simply see the Ukrainian population as a weapon to use against Russia. They care nothing for Ukrainian soldiers and they care nothing for Ukrainian civilians. So that is why I believe the Americans are sending these disgraceful weapons to the Ukrainian government.
Dr. Papadopoulos, if we want to talk about the Russian response, Russia said, of course, Russia talked about the repercussions of this measure, and Russia said that it will respond in an appropriate way on the military level. How can you assess this response?
Well, the Russian military, like the American military, know that cluster bombs do not constitute a game changer, unlike for what the useful idiots in Western mainstream media are saying. However, we have to remember that there is an information war being fought between America and Russia over the course of the war in Ukraine. So that is why the Russians are saying in public that the supply of cluster bombs could lead to an escalation of the war in Ukraine. The reality, of course, is that ever since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, there has been various channels of communication between the White House and the Kremlin to ensure that there will never be a nuclear war between America and Russia. What the Americans and the Russians say in public is very different to what they say to each other in private. The Russian and the American High Command speak with each other on a daily basis, and the Americans and the Russians will not allow anyone or any government in the world to try and instigate a nuclear war between them. That applies to the Ukrainian government and to the British government. And let me tell you and your audience that in private, the American government has severely reprimanded the British for trying to provoke a war between America and Russia, a nuclear war. And in the past, the Americans have severely disciplined the British in private for having nearly caused a global war. For example, the Suez Canal crisis, and also during the Kosovo War, when the British were calling on the Americans to launch a ground invasion of Kosovo and Metohija. So the Americans and the Russians know how to maintain peace between themselves, and for that we should all be eternally grateful. Whatever we think of the Americans and the Russians will not allow anyone or any government to provoke a war between themselves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Papadopoulos, the host. Thanking you and introducing you once again. Thank you, sir.